On March 14th,
Delta 4-2,
2023, air
emergency
traffic
procedures
control at
activated.
Great Falls
Cleared to
International
land
Airport
runway
in Montana
1.
logged
I
something
repeat,
they had
runway
never seen
1.
before. A Boeing 737 commercial full passenger load appeared on radar at 21,000 feet and descending. No radio contact, no transponder acknowledgement, no response on any frequency. The aircraft was there on the screen, moving steadily, losing altitude and completely silent. The duty controller tried 6 times, nothing. Protocol required 1 call to the Air Force. That call went to Malmstrom Air Force Base 80 miles to the east. 11 minutes later, 2 F-22 Raptors were airborne. What those pilots saw when they reached the 737, what they watched unfold from 30,000 feet above the Montana high plains, would become the kind of story that moves through military aviation like weather. Quietly, steadily, without announcement. The kind of story that gets told in ready rooms late at night, when the lights are low and the day's flying is done, and someone says, "Did you hear what happened on Flight 2847? But before any of that, before the F-22s, before Great Falls, before the cockpit door opened on something that should not have been possible, there was a woman in seat 14C. She looked like anyone you have ever sat next to on a flight and immediately forgotten. Her jeans were faded, the kind of faded that comes from actual use rather than deliberate design. Her gray sweater was plain, no logo, no pattern. Her white sneakers had small scuffs on the toe that she had never bothered to address. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail held by a plain black elastic band. She carried a paperback novel with a cracked spine, a small travel pillow folded against the window, and a carry-on bag that had seen enough airport floors to show it. She had ordered ginger ale when the cart came through. The flight attendant handed her the plastic cup without looking up. Just another passenger. Just another face. One of 173 people moving through the ordinary machinery of air travel, suspended at 37,000 feet, somewhere above the northern Rockies, going from one place to another on a Tuesday morning in March. Nobody on Flight 2847 from Seattle to Boston knew the truth about the woman in 14C. The businessman across the aisle didn't know. The flight attendant didn't know. The young mother 3 rows ahead reading quietly to her 6-year-old daughter didn't know. Nobody knew, and the woman in 14C preferred it that way. Her name was Kate Harmon. She was 42 years old, and for the first time in 17 years, she was not flying anything. She was just a passenger. She had worked very hard to become that. If you looked closely, and nobody on that flight did, you might have noticed one small thing. A habit so ingrained it had become invisible even to her. Every so often, her right hand would drift upward from the armrest across her body and rest briefly against her chest just below her left collarbone. A light touch, a check, like a man reaching to confirm his wallet is still there. What she was checking was not a wallet. It was a pair of military dog tags on a worn ball chain tucked beneath her sweater. The metal had been warm against her skin for so long that she no longer noticed the temperature. She only noticed when they weren't there, which had happened exactly once on a morning in 2019 when she had gone for a run and left them on the nightstand and had turned around and gone back for them before she had made it 2 blocks from her apartment. The tags read, Harmon Garrett W.O. positive. United States Air Force. Garrett Harmon had been a lieutenant colonel. He had flown F-4 Phantoms and later F-16s. He had accumulated more than 3,000 flight hours across a career that spanned 2 decades. His commanding officer had once written in an evaluation that Garrett Harmon possessed the kind of spatial awareness and aircraft instinct that could not be taught, only discovered. He had died on a clear Tuesday morning in August of 1993. A training flight. Routine. The kind of mission experience pilots fly while thinking about other things. Nothing wrong with the weather, nothing in the aircraft logs to suggest a problem. A takeoff, a series of maneuvers, and then something had gone wrong in a way that no one on the ground understood until it was finished. The official investigation had taken 4 months and produced a conclusion that fit cleanly in a single sentence. Pilot error. Kate Harmon had been 12 years old when a uniformed officer knocked on the front door of their house in Colorado Springs. She remembered that her mother had been in the kitchen making lunch. She remembered the sound of the screen door, the way the officer held his hat in both hands in front of him, the way the afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made everything look slightly wrong, like a photograph taken with a camera that wasn't quite level. She remembered her mother's knees giving way, and she remembered the dog tags. They had been returned with his personal effects. Her mother had held them for 3 days and then placed them in a small ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, where they sat for 6 weeks until the morning Kate picked them up on her way to school and put them in her jacket pocket. She had never put them back. That was 30 years ago. She had been carrying them for 30 years, And in all that time, she had never once believed what the report said. Pilots made errors. She knew that better than almost anyone alive. She had flown F-16 and F-18 through conditions that would have grounded most aircraft and most pilots. She had made mistakes of her own. She had caught those mistakes. She understood intimately the difference between an error a pilot makes and an error a pilot cannot prevent. She understood it in her hands and in her chest the way a carpenter understands wood. Not as theory, but as material, as texture, as something you know without needing to articulate it. What happened to her father was not an error he made. She had known it since she was 12. She had carried that knowledge like a second weight alongside the tags themselves. And she had spent 17 years of active military service looking for the proof that would finally close the distance between what she knew and what she could demonstrate. In the spring of 2022, she had found it. By then, she was a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base, evaluating a new aircraft system. She had access to maintenance logs and component tracking databases that most pilots never saw. She had been following a thread quietly on her own time with the patience of someone who has been waiting a long time and has learned not to rush. And one evening in April, a database cross-reference returned a result that made her sit very still in her chair for a long time before she moved again. The HV7 series recirculation valve, a small component in the aircraft air management system. Not glamorous, not the kind of part that appeared in accident reports with any frequency. But when it failed, and under certain pressure conditions, it could fail in a way that was subtle and cumulative. It produced a chemical contamination in the cockpit air supply that presented initially as mild disorientation and progressed, if undetected, to complete incapacitation. The failure pattern was documented. It was in the records buried under 2 decades of maintenance database reorganizations, but it was there. And the serial number range of the valves that carried this defect, a defect the manufacturer had identified internally and never disclosed, overlapped exactly with the components installed in the aircraft Garrett Harmon had been flying on a clear Tuesday morning in August of 1993. Kate had filed the report in May of 2022. She had been thorough. She had been methodical. She had documented everything, cross-referenced every data point, and written with the careful precision of someone who understood that the strength of an argument lives entirely in the quality of its evidence. She had sent it up the chain. She had followed up. She had waited. The response came 6 weeks later. The HV7 valve concern had been reviewed and classified as non-critical. Monitoring protocols had been noted. No further action was required at this time. Kate had read that letter 3 times. Then she had submitted her retirement paperwork. Not in anger, not in a moment of hot frustration she would later regret. She had waited 2 weeks before signing anything to make sure it wasn't emotion driving the decision. It wasn't emotion. It was something quieter and more final. The understanding that she had given the system everything she had, every hour of flight, every risk, every year, and the system, when she had finally asked it to do one specific and necessary thing, had looked at the evidence and chosen not to. She was done. She retired in December of 2022. She packed her apartment in California into a rental truck. She bought new civilian clothes that felt strange on her body. She read paperback novels with cracked spines. She booked commercial flights because she had not flown commercially in years, and she thought that being a passenger, just a passenger, would be good practice for the life she was trying to build. And that was how Kate Harmon ended up in Seat 14C on Flight 2847, flying from Seattle to Boston to spend a week with her younger sister on a Tuesday in March, 30 years to the month after her father's funeral. She had her novel open in her lap. She was not reading it. The man in 14B had introduced himself 40 minutes earlier. Reed Ellison Software Sales, based out of Chicago, traveling to Boston for a client meeting. He was clearly anxious about. He had mentioned it 3 times in the first 10 minutes. He was 38, well-dressed in the studied way of someone who had recently started caring about clothes, and he talked the way some people eat, steadily, without much pause, finding comfort in the activity itself. Kate had listened. She had asked questions at the right intervals. She had nodded and smiled when appropriate. She had given none of herself away. When Reed asked what she did for work, she answered the way she always answered now. Logistics. I work in logistics. It was technically true. She had spent 17 years moving aircraft through contested airspace under time pressure with zero margin for error. That was logistics. Reed nodded and resumed talking about his client. 3 rows ahead, Nora Callahan was reading to her daughter, Emma, age 6, who held a stuffed rabbit with one ear slightly shorter than the other and was looking at the illustrations with the focused seriousness of a child who takes stories as seriously as most adults take contracts. Nora had dark hair in the organized calm of a woman who had learned to manage uncertainty by reducing its variables wherever possible. She had checked her seatbelt 3 times before the aircraft reached cruising altitude. She was the kind of mother who prepared. Outside the window, the Rockies had given way to the high plains of Montana, brown and vast, and crossed by the long straight lines of roads that went from nowhere to nowhere at the same unhurried angle. At 37,000 feet, the landscape had the quality of a map reduced, simplified, stripped of the details that made it complicated at ground level. Kate found she liked looking at it. There was something honest about altitude. Things became what they actually were without decoration. She closed her eyes. She had not slept well in months. Something about the absence of structure, the routines and requirements that had organized every day for 17 years, had left her sleep shallow and interrupted. But here, suspended between Seattle and Boston, with nothing required of her, with the steady engine noise filling the cabin and Reed's voice fading to background texture, she felt her body beginning to release something it had been holding for a long time. She was almost asleep when she heard it. It was not a sound exactly, or not primarily a sound. It was a change, a variation in the frequency of the vibration moving through the airframe, a shift of maybe 0.5% in the low harmonic that every jet produces and every passenger absorbs without registering. A civilian would not have caught it in 100 flights. A recreational pilot would not have noticed it. Even most commercial pilots, accustomed to trusting their instruments over their senses, might have let it pass without note. Kate had spent 17 years training herself not to let things pass. Her eyes opened. She sat still and listened. Not with her ears only, with everything. With the soles of her feet against the floor and her palms against the armrests in the part of her nervous system that had been calibrated over thousands of flight hours to detect the difference between normal and almost normal. There it was again, a fraction of a second, a whisper of deviation. Her right hand moved to her chest. Her fingers found the dog tags beneath the sweater. Reed Ellison was saying something about software licensing agreements. Kate no longer heard him. She was watching the wing through the oval window, the surface, the flap position, the way the light moved across the upper curve. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as it should, but it didn't sound right. 22 seconds later, the intercom clicked on. Captain Warren Mercer's voice came through, and Kate recognized immediately not the words, but the quality beneath them. The controlled steadiness of a pilot who has just made the decision to say the least alarming version of a true thing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're going to make a brief precautionary descent to a lower altitude. Nothing to be concerned about. Flight attendants, please return to your seats. Reed Ellison stopped talking about software. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged the uncertain glances of people who have been told not to worry and have immediately started worrying. The flight attendants moved to their jump seats with the brisk efficiency of people executing a drill they had rehearsed many times and hoped never to use in earnest. Kate unbuckled her seatbelt. She was standing before the click of the buckle finished. The flight attendant nearest the front, Vivian, her name tag read, a woman in her 40s with the composure of someone who had managed difficult situations on aircraft for long enough to make it look routine, noticed Kate immediately and moved to intercept. "Ma'am, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. I need to speak with the captain." Kate's voice was level, not loud, not aggressive. The voice of someone who has given and received instructions for long enough that both feel identical. "That's not possible right now. Please sit down." Kate was already moving. Vivian stepped in front of her, and Kate stopped, not because she couldn't have moved around her, but because this woman was doing her job and deserved a moment of honesty. "I'm a pilot," Kate said quietly, close enough that only Vivian could hear. "Military, 17 years. Something is wrong with your aircraft, and I need to check on the flight crew right now." Vivian studied her for exactly 2 seconds, the study of someone who reads people for a living. Then the cockpit door opened from the inside and a second flight attendant stepped out. Her face was the color of old paper. Her hands were shaking visibly. She looked at Vivian, and her voice came out in the register of someone managing something very large with a very small amount of remaining steadiness. "I need medical assistance." She kept it low. "Both pilots are unconscious. Something is wrong with them. They won't respond." The cabin heard it anyway. The sound that moved through 173 people was not panic yet. It was the sound of 173 people trying to decide whether to panic, which is its own particular frequency and entirely distinct from the thing itself. Kate was already through the door. The cockpit of a Boeing 737 is a small space filled with an extraordinary density of information. Screens and gauges and switches and indicators arranged with the logic of a system designed so that two trained professionals can divide the work between them and maintain awareness of all of it simultaneously. Kate had never flown a commercial 737. She had flown things with similar principles in wildly different personalities. She understood the architecture even without knowing every address. What she understood immediately was this: Captain Warren Mercer was slumped forward against his harness, chin against his chest, completely unresponsive. The first officer, young, maybe 29 or 30, was back against his seat with his eyes closed, breathing, but deeply gone, as though he had simply fallen asleep mid-sentence. The cockpit held the faint, slightly wrong smell of something chemical. Not strong, not obvious. The kind of smell that told Kate it had been building for longer than anyone had noticed. The altimeter read 21,400 feet. Still descending. The autopilot was executing the last instruction Mercer had given it: descend to a lower altitude, and would continue executing that instruction until someone changed it or the aircraft ran out of altitude to lose. Kate looked at the radio panel. Error codes across multiple systems. Not random. A cascade. The failure signature of something that began in one place and propagated outward through connected systems, each failure making the next one more likely. She looked at the error codes the way a physician looks at symptoms, not one at a time, but as a pattern, looking for the origin, looking for the first domino. And she found it. It was not in a prominent position on the panel. It was a secondary indicator, the kind of alert generated by a subsystem that most pilots never need to think about consciously because it works correctly essentially all the time. The code read HV7 Resurrect Fault. Kate read those 4 words. She read them a second time. The cockpit was quiet except for the soft, steady sounds of a large aircraft maintaining its descent through the sky above Montana. HV7 series recirculation valve. She knew this code. She knew this failure. She had documented it in 47 pages of a report that had been received, reviewed, classified as non-critical, and filed somewhere in the machinery of a system that had decided it was not worth addressing. She had written that report because of her father. She had written it because of what had been done to his aircraft, and what that had done to him, and what that had done to a 12-year-old girl standing in a hallway in Colorado Springs, watching a uniformed officer turn her mother's knees to water. She had written the report, and the system had looked at it and said not critical enough. And so here she was, 30 years after August of 1993, standing in a cockpit above Montana with the same failure code on the screen, 2 unconscious pilots and 173 people in the cabin behind her who had no idea that the warning had already been given and ignored. The same valve, the same failure, a different aircraft, a different pilot, a different Tuesday, but the same unbroken chain running from 1993 to a filing cabinet in 2022 to this moment right now at 20,600 feet and descending. Kate stood still for what was probably 3 seconds and felt like considerably longer. She felt the weight of the dog tags against her chest. She had been carrying them for 30 years because she was not finished yet, because she had known since she was 12 years old that there was something left to do. She had not always known what it was. For most of her life, she had thought it was a report, a formal accounting, a piece of paper with evidence attached that would finally force the system to acknowledge what it had done. Standing in that cockpit looking at that error code, she understood that it had never been just a report. It was this specific moment, this aircraft, these people. She sat down in the captain's seat. She reached up and stopped the descent, overriding the autopilot's last instruction, leveling the aircraft at 15,000 feet while she oriented herself. The 737 responded slowly compared to what she was used to, heavier, more deliberate, with the inertia of something built to carry great weight over great distance with maximum efficiency and minimum drama. She adjusted quickly. Every aircraft had its own character. You had to listen. You had to let it tell you what it was. She scanned the instruments. Fuel adequate for Great Falls with reserve. Engines both running, temperatures normal. The communication systems had cascaded out completely dead. Navigation was intact. The moving map showed their position clearly: central Montana, the Missouri River watershed mountains to the west, plains to the east, and Great Falls International Airport, 38 miles ahead and slightly north. Long runways, adequate for a 737. Vivian appeared in the doorway. "What do we do?" Her voice was steady. The question was genuine. "Tell them we have the situation under control." Kate did not look up from the instruments. Seatbelts on all of them, and open every air vent in the cabin. Maximum flow. Vivian understood without being told why. She nodded once and left. Kate looked at the navigation display and set a heading for Great Falls. The aircraft banked gently north. She reached up and settled her hand against the outside of her sweater where the dog tags rested against her sternum. She said very quietly to no one visible and to one person in particular, "I hear you, Dad." Then she went to work. She started with the basics, not because she needed to remind herself of the basics. She had logged more than 4,000 flight hours across aircraft that made the Boeing 737 look straightforward. She started with the basics because the basics were where you went when everything else had been taken away, and right now everything else had been taken away. No co-pilot, no radio, no tower, no weather brief, no approach plates for an airport she had never seen from inside a cockpit. No margin for the kind of error that a second set of hands and eyes existed to catch. Just the aircraft. Just the instruments. Just her. She started at the team and worked down. Altitude 15,000 feet stabilized. She had stopped the descent and the aircraft was holding level, the autopilot maintaining the new instruction with the patient mechanical faithfulness of a system that does not understand urgency. Airspeed 280 knots. She would need to slow considerably before beginning her approach. The 737 did not respond to last-minute requests the way a fighter did. It had weight and momentum in its own sense of timing, and if you tried to rush it, it would tell you in the heaviest possible way that it had not agreed to be rushed. Engines both running temperatures, normal oil pressure, normal fuel flow within parameters. She checked each one twice. Fuel: they had departed Seattle with a full load for the Boston run. They had burned approximately 2 hours worth. What remained was more than adequate for Great Falls with reserve. Fuel was not a problem she needed to carry into the cockpit alongside everything else. Navigation: the moving map showed them 36 miles from Great Falls International. At current airspeed, roughly 8 minutes before she would need to begin configuring the aircraft. 8 minutes to finish her scan, brief herself on the approach, and decide exactly how she was going to put 150,000 pounds of aluminum and fuel and humanity onto a runway she had never used. Communication still dead. She tried the primary radio twice more, cycling through emergency frequencies, by memory getting nothing back but the silence of equipment that had stopped listening. She checked the transponder. It was squawking the emergency code 7700 automatically, which meant that somewhere on the ground, someone's radar screening was showing a distress signal from a commercial aircraft that had gone radio silent over Montana. That was something, a signal in the dark. She reached for the intercom panel and pressed the cabin address button. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice came out exactly as she intended. Steady, unhurried. The voice of someone with a plan. Not because she felt steady and unhurried, but because she understood that the sound of her voice in the next several minutes was itself a piece of equipment that needed to be operated correctly. "This is the pilot. We are currently at 15,000 feet proceeding toward Great Falls, Montana, where we will be landing shortly. I need everyone seated with seatbelts fastened. Your flight attendants will assist you. Please remain calm." She released the button. In the cabin, Vivian was moving through the rows with the efficiency of someone given a clear task who intends to complete it. She spoke to passengers in the low, firm tones of professional reassurance. She checked belts. She guided the few people who had stood up back into their seats. She kept her face arranged in an expression that said, "This is being handled, and I am not frightened, and therefore you should not be frightened either." It was an expression that required considerable effort. Reed Ellison was sitting with both hands flat on his thighs, laptop closed, tray table up, looking at the back of the seat in front of him. He was not moving. He was not talking. He had simply stopped the way a clock stops when its mechanism encounters something it cannot process. The man who had filled 40 minutes of shared airspace with words about software and client meetings and quarterly targets had arrived somewhere that words did not reach. 3 rows ahead, Nora Callahan had her arm around Emma and was speaking very quietly into the girl's ear. Emma was holding the stuffed rabbit with one ear shorter than the other and looking out the window at the clouds below with the uncomplicated interest of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of altitude. Kate ran the checklist. She called each item aloud, the old habit, the trained reflex of years of flying with co-pilots whose job was to confirm each call. There was no one to confirm now. She was both pilots. She called the items and answered them herself and moved on because incomplete was not an option, and complete was the only thing standing between where they were and where they needed to be. She was 4 minutes into this when she noticed the headache. It had been there for a while, she realized. She had been managing it the way you manage low-level discomfort when there is something more important to think about, filed, noted, set aside. But now, in the relative quiet of the checklist, it asserted itself more clearly. A pressure behind her eyes, a heaviness in the front of her skull with a specific quality she recognized. She made herself think about it with the cold efficiency of someone who had calculated odds under pressure many times and had learned that the calculation itself was never the enemy. She had walked into the cockpit approximately 12 minutes ago. The contamination had been building in the cockpit's air supply, not for 12 minutes, but for however long the HV7 valve had been failing. Mercer and his first officer had been exposed to a higher concentration for longer. They were down. She had walked in after the cockpit air had been partially diluted by the open cabin connection. She had been exposed to less than they had received for a shorter period, but she had still been exposed. The progression of HV7 exposure was documented in the report she had written. Initial stage mild disorientation, slight visual disturbance, manageable performance degradation. She was at the initial stage, possibly past it. Second stage began somewhere between 40 and 50 minutes of sustained exposure. It involves significant cognitive impairment, motor function deterioration, and rapid progression toward incapacitation. She had opened the cabin vents. Cleaner air was cycling forward, but the cockpit had been the source. She was still in the source. If the contamination was progressing at the lower end of the documented rate possible given the partial ventilation she had between 40 and 50 minutes before she moved from manageable to not manageable, Great Falls was now 31 miles away. At current airspeed accounting for the time needed to slow and configure the aircraft she was looking at 18 to 22 minutes until touchdown. The margins were not comfortable. The margins were, however, margins. She had flown on smaller ones. She did not tell Vivian. There was nothing Vivian could do with that information except worry more effectively, and Vivian's worry was not a resource Kate needed right now. Vivian was keeping 173 people calm. Kate was not going to interrupt that with information that served no tactical purpose. She pressed on. She was studying the moving map with focused attention when the knock came. 3 times. Deliberate. The cockpit door. She did not turn around. She was running a fuel calculation. The door opened, then Reed Ellison's voice stripped of everything that had been in it 40 minutes earlier. Quieter, without forward momentum. I know this sounds insane. He was keeping his voice controlled with visible effort. But I've got my private pilot license. 20 hours. I'm not saying I can fly this. I'm saying maybe there's something I can do. Kate finished the fuel calculation. She understood what it had cost him to knock on that door. 20 hours of flight training was nothing in the context of what was happening in this cockpit, and he knew it, which made the offer an act of courage rather than delusion. He had done the same math she had and concluded that 20 hours was better than nothing. He had been right that it wasn't nothing. He had been wrong that there was anything she could use it for. Sit down, Mr. Ellison. She said it without looking up. Put your seatbelt on. That is the most useful thing you can do right now. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She could feel him standing there. There was nothing else to say. He went back to his seat. She flew. At 18 miles, she began her descent. She pulled the thrust levers back smoothly, feeling the engines reduce their output, the aircraft's nose beginning to pitch down as the energy state changed. She adjusted, compensating. The 737 was telling her things constantly, through the controls, through the sounds of the airframe, through the behavior of the instruments, and she was listening to all of it simultaneously with her whole body rather than just her mind. Flaps to position 1. The aircraft slowed. She felt the drag. She added a small amount of thrust to maintain her descent rate without accelerating, finding the balance. The 737 found its new configuration and settled. Kate moved to the next item. Flaps 5. The aircraft slowed further. She checked her speed, slightly fast, which was exactly where she wanted to be. Speed was energy, and energy was options, and she was not in a position to surrender options unnecessarily. She was at 12 miles when the radio came alive. Not a clean signal, a transmission fighting through interference, breaking up, reassembling itself in fragments. Like a voice reaching through something solid. Kate grabbed the receiver. The voice was Dana Reeves. She had known Dana Reeves for 11 years. She had flown under her command for 4 of those years at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. She had eaten meals in her kitchen and borrowed her jacket once during a winter deployment and trusted her judgment in situations where judgment was the only currency that mattered. Dana Reeves' callsign Viper was the person who had called Kate the week after the retirement paperwork and said nothing for a long moment and then said simply, "I know. And I'm sorry." The signal broke in and out. Solo, the word, her word, fragmentary but unmistakable. "I know that's you static situation. I'm here." Kate keyed the transmit button. "Viper." The connection held for a moment. She heard breathing on the other end. Then Viper's voice steadier through the noise. "I know it's you. I trust you. Do you static?" Do you hear me, Solo Viper? I'm at 12 miles. I have the field. I can do this. She did not know if the transmission went through. The signal held for 4 more seconds. Then it died. Not a fade, a cut. Clean and total. The interference codes on the radio panel shifted and the frequencies went back to dead silence. And the cockpit was quiet again except for the sounds of a large aircraft moving through cold air at 12,000 feet. Kate held the receiver a moment longer than she needed to. She put it back. She did not think about what she would have said if the signal had held. She thought about Great Falls. She thought about runway 03. She thought about the next configuration point and what her speed needed to be at 8 miles. She thought about these things because they were the things that would bring 173 people home. At 30,000 feet above her, Declan Caldwell had found the aircraft. He had rolled his F-22 to bring his targeting pod to bear on the 737 below, and then rolled back level and sat with what he saw for a long moment before saying anything on the radio. Tower, Raptor 11. I have visual on the target. She is established on what looks like a visual approach to Great Falls. No smoke, no visible damage. Gear not yet down. Flying a clean profile. Copy Raptor 11. No communication with that aircraft. Confirm emergency code on transponder. Confirmed. He paused. She's slowing correctly. Configured correctly. Whoever is flying that aircraft knows what they're doing. He believed it when he said it. He also believed privately that there was a meaningful difference between knowing what you were doing and being able to finish what you had started. A lot could still go wrong between here and the runway. A single pilot approach to an unfamiliar airport with no tower guidance and unknown traffic, and God only knew what the runway conditions looked like at Great Falls. He was watching the profile, and the profile was good, and he was still not ready to assume good was going to be enough. He watched. Kate was at 8 miles. She had been noting the headache the way you note weather that has not yet become a problem, cataloging it, tracking its progression against her internal timeline. So far, it had not crossed from discomfort into interference. Her vision was clear. Her hands were responding to what she asked of them. Her thinking felt linear and consecutive. She reached for the landing gear lever. Gear down. The sound came through the aircraft's structure, the mechanical sequence of hydraulics, and locks the massive undercarriage of a 737 deploying from its housings and extending into the airstream below. A deep groan followed by a series of thumps and then 3 green lights on the indicator panel. Down, locked, good. Flaps 15. The aircraft changed its character again, slowing, settling into the configuration that said, "We are serious now. We are committed to the direction of the ground." She added power to maintain the descent rate she wanted. The altimeter was unwinding steadily. 6,000 feet. 5,000. She could see Great Falls. It was there on the horizon, a geometry of roads and structures and the glint of the Missouri River catching afternoon light to the north. And the airport distinct from the city grid with its long parallel lines of runway concrete intersected by the shorter crossing strip. She was reaching for the autopilot disconnect when her vision went. Not completely. Not darkness. A blurring at the edges, a loss of sharpness in the center, a nauseating sense that the instruments in front of her had shifted slightly. She blinked hard. She pressed the heels of her hands against the instrument panel for 3 seconds. She breathed deliberately twice, pulling what clean air existed in the cockpit down into her lungs. The blur lasted 5 seconds. It left behind a headache that had moved from catalog entry to active problem. She assessed without judgment. This was not the time for judgment. The second stage was arriving ahead of schedule. She had been in the cockpit continuously without relief, and the timeline had adjusted accordingly. She had 5 miles. She had to land this aircraft in the next 7 minutes, or the aircraft was going to land without her conscious participation. And that was not a landing. She disconnected the autopilot. The yoke came alive in her hands. This was the exact moment she had lived in 1,000 times across 17 years in a dozen different aircraft. The moment when the machine stopped flying itself and started listening to you. When the mediation ended and the conversation became direct. She felt the 737's weight through the yoke, its inertia, its slightly nose-heavy tendency at this speed and configuration. She made a small correction left, a small correction in pitch. She found the aircraft's preference where it wanted to sit, and she worked with it rather than against it. 4 miles. She called the checklist aloud, both pilot voices, the habit of years adapting to the need of the moment without ceremony. She was present in the aircraft in a way she had not been present in anything since she had signed the retirement papers. The accumulated weight of the past 6 months, the formlessness, The shallow sleep, the sense of moving through days that did not quite cohere, all of it was gone. There was only this aircraft, this approach, this runway growing in the windscreen. Then she saw the Cessna. It was lifting off from runway 21, the crossing runway climbing away in a left turn that would take it directly across her approach path. She calculated. She was at 4 miles. The Cessna was climbing through approximately 600 feet and turning left, tracking toward her approach corridor. At their respective speeds and trajectories, they would intersect in somewhere between 25 and 35 seconds. 3 options. Go around, abandon the approach climb, away, reposition. In a normal situation, this was the conservative choice. In this situation, a go-around meant reconfiguring the aircraft while her visual field was degrading, extending her time in the contaminated cockpit by at least another 5 minutes, and attempting a second approach with whatever cognitive function remained. A go-around here was not conservative. It was a worse gamble. Continue at current descent, maintain her profile, and hope the Cessna cleared in time. She ran the geometry. Too close. The timing worked only if the Cessna's pilot made no deviation from his current turn. Steepen the descent, increase her descent rate to pass beneath the Cessna's climb path, accepting a lower crossing altitude in exchange for guaranteed separation. The most technically demanding option, the one with the smallest margin for error. The one she chose. She pushed forward on the yoke, the nose dropped. She felt the aircraft accelerate slightly into the steeper angle, compensated with a reduction in thrust, held the speed exactly where it needed to be. The Cessna rose through her windscreen view and passed above her as she went beneath it. The separation between them wider than it had looked in the first calculation, the geometry resolving cleanly because she had committed to it completely and executed it without hesitation. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this the way she had noticed the headache as information. Her hands were shaking, but they were on the controls and the controls were not shaking. The aircraft was not shaking. The aircraft was on course at the correct speed configured for landing, tracking the center line of runway 03 with the steadiness of something that did not know what its pilot's hands were doing and did not need to. Flaps to the full landing position. The aircraft slowed to approach speed. 145 knots. She was at 800 feet. The runway filled the windscreen. She could see the threshold markings, the centerline stripe, the distance boards along the sides of the concrete. She could see the grass alongside the runway, moving gently in the light northwest wind. She made a correction for the crosswind. A small left bank, a small right rudder, keeping the nose tracking the centerline while the body of the aircraft crabbed slightly into the wind. She held it. At 200 feet, she began the flare. She pulled back gently on the yoke, raising the nose, beginning the transition from the descent angle to the landing attitude. The runway rose toward her. The rate of descent reduced. She could feel the aircraft beginning to lose lift as the speed bled back toward the stall margin, the point at which the wings stopped flying and the ground took over. She held the flare. At 50 feet, she pulled the thrust levers to idle. Her left hand continued the back pressure on the yoke, holding the nose up, feeling for the ground, the way you feel for a step in the dark, not with your eyes, but with your sense of where things are. The altimeter unwound in single digits. The ground was very close. The main wheels touched. The chirp of rubber on concrete was the cleanest sound she had heard in a very long time. She let the nose wheel come down. Not dropped, eased, controlled, deliberate. Her hand went to the speed brake lever, and she deployed them, feeling the drag throw itself against the aircraft's forward motion. Her right hand went to the thrust levers and pulled them into reverse, and the reversers opened with a roar that shook the airframe. Her feet worked the rudder pedals, tracking the centerline as the aircraft decelerated through 120 knots through 90 through 60. She applied brakes smooth and measured, not the panicked grab of emergency braking, but the steady pressure of someone who has 10,500 feet of runway available and does not need all of it. The aircraft slowed. It rolled. It stopped. 2,900 feet past the threshold. Less than a third of the available runway. A landing so smooth that the chirp of the mains touching was the first indication most passengers had that they were on the ground at all. Kate sat in the captain's seat with both hands still on the controls. She reached up and began the shutdown sequence, pulling the fuel cutoff levers methodically, listening to the turbines wind down from their working pitch to a declining whine to silence. The silence came in stages. Each stage was its own kind of relief. When the last engine was quiet, she took her hands off the controls. She placed them on her thighs, and they shook. Not slightly. They shook with the completeness of something that has been held rigid through tremendous force and has finally been given permission to let go. She looked at them for a moment with detached interest, the way you look at something that belongs to you but can be observed from a slight distance. Her vision was narrowing at the edges. The headache had become a pressure that pushed outward from behind her eyes. Through the fuselage, she could hear the sounds of emergency vehicles approaching, the distant wail of sirens, the specific pitch of equipment moving at speed across tarmac. Someone on the ground had seen them land. Someone had understood what they were looking at. She put her hand against her chest. The dog tags were there, warm, solid. The same weight they had always been, no more and no less, the weight of a man who had died in an aircraft because a valve that should have been fixed was not fixed, and of a daughter who had spent 30 years carrying the proof of that fact, looking for the moment when it would mean something. She thought it might have meant something today. She reached for the cockpit door. She opened it, and the cabin erupted. The sound hit her like a physical thing. Not the volume of it, though. The volume was considerable. 173 people releasing the accumulated tension of the past 45 minutes in a single sustained moment produces a sound that has weight and texture and heat. It was the quality underneath the volume, the particular human frequency of people who have just understood that they are still alive and are feeling that understanding move through them for the first time. Kate stood in the cockpit doorway and heard it and felt something she did not yet have a name for. She had spent the last 45 minutes in a place that required the complete suspension of everything except function, and the journey back from that place was not instantaneous. She was aware of the sound, the way she was aware of the headache, and the shaking in her hands as information about the state of the world processed and noted and set alongside everything else she was carrying. Vivian was the first person to reach her. She stopped 2 feet away and looked at Kate with an expression that contained several things at once: relief, disbelief, something that might have been reverence, and then seemed to realize that none of those things were what was needed right now. What was needed was the same professionalism that had carried her through the past 45 minutes, and she reached for it and found it. The paramedics need to get to the pilots first. Vivian said it and was already turning, already doing the next thing. Kate nodded. She stepped out into the cabin aisle and the sound changed. It did not get quieter. It got closer. Passengers who had been restrained by their seatbelts were now leaning forward against them, reaching toward her as she passed, hands extended in the human impulse to touch the thing that has just saved you, to confirm through contact that it is real. She walked through it the way you walk through weather present, moving, accepting whatever came without deflecting it. A woman grabbed her forearm with both hands. A man in a business suit was crying without apparent awareness that he was crying, tears running steadily down a face that was otherwise composed in an expression of pure relief. An older couple near the back had their foreheads pressed together, hands clasped between them, not looking at Kate at all, just at each other. She made it toward the rear of the cabin. She turned. She looked down the length of the aircraft at all of them, at every face and every bent head and every pair of hands holding another pair of hands. 173 people. She had carried them the way she had carried her father's dog tags, without being asked, without an alternative, because they were hers to carry in the moment when carrying was what the moment required. Reed Ellison was standing near the rear, apart from the press of reaching hands. He was not reaching toward her. He was not saying anything. He was standing with his arms at his sides, watching her come down the aisle with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who has revised a significant assumption and is still working out what the revision means for everything that assumption had been holding up. He was a man who filled silence with words as a reflex, as the primary tool he carried. He had no words right now, and he knew it. Their eyes met for a moment as she passed. He nodded once. She nodded back. It was enough. Vivian had opened the forward door, and the paramedics were boarding, moving toward the cockpit with their equipment and their focused urgency. Kate watched them go and thought Warren Mercer, Brian Calloway. She hoped they were going to be all right. Based on everything she knew about HV-7 exposure timelines, they probably would be. They would wake up in a hospital in Great Falls confused and headachy and alive. The thought arrived and then receded as her vision blurred again. Sharper this time. Not 5 seconds, but longer. She put her hand against the rear bulkhead and waited for it to pass, and it passed slower than before and left a residue of nausea that she breathed through with deliberate care. The emergency slides had deployed at the forward and rear doors. Kate walked toward the forward door. She meant to be the last one off. She got 4 steps into the aisle before her legs reached a negotiated limit, a message from somewhere below, conscious intention, that they had performed a service under unusual conditions for an extended period and were formally requesting a pause. She caught the seat back on her right with her forearm and held herself upright while the aisle moved slightly in a way that aisles were not supposed to move. A paramedic materialized beside her. young, broad-shouldered, with the alert stillness of someone trained to arrive at the exact moment of need. "Ma'am," his hands were already under her arm. "I've got you." She almost said, "I'm fine." She had said it 1,000 times. In debrief rooms after missions that had pushed every system to its limit. In medical bays after flights that had left her shaking in ways she did not show until the door was closed. "I'm fine" had been the currency she used to pay for the privilege of continuing, of not being grounded, of remaining in the one place where she had always known precisely what she was. She did not say it this time. She let him take her weight. She was in the ambulance before she understood quite how she had gotten there. The light inside was clinical and bright. She was lying on a gurney watching a paramedic work, and she realized her hand was still against her chest, still holding the dog tags through the sweater. She let go. She folded her hand in her lap and looked at the ceiling of the ambulance and let the paramedics do their work and thought about nothing in particular for what felt like the first time in 30 years.
Tamam.
The room they gave her at Benefice Health System was on the second floor with a window that faced west. The Rocky Mountain front was visible from here, the long, dramatic escarpment where the plains ended, and the rock began catching the late afternoon light, the way the mountains caught it out here, which was differently from anywhere else. The light was orange and horizontal, and it made the mountains look painted. Kate sat in the bed with the IV running and watched the light change. Captain Warren Mercer and his first officer, Brian Calloway, 29 years old, third year with the airline, were 2 rooms down the hall, both conscious, both stable, both going to be fine. An attending physician had used the phrase "fully expected to recover," and Kate had let it settle into her chest and said nothing. The FAA representative arrived 20 minutes later. He sat in the chair beside the bed with a legal pad and a voice recorder and asked questions in the careful language of someone conducting an official inquiry. Kate answered in the same language because it was a language she was fluent in and because the answers mattered and she wanted them on record correctly. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "I want you to know," he said, "that what you did today was," he stopped, found the word, "extraordinary, and that this investigation is going to take everything you've told us seriously." Kate looked at him steadily. "The report I filed in May 2022 is in the FAA system under my name," she said. "Everything I found about the HV7 series valve is in that report. I'd like it to be part of this investigation's record from the beginning, not as a footnote." He wrote something on the legal pad. "It will be," he said. She watched him go. She sat alone. The room settled around her. The IV dripped. Outside the window, the mountains were catching the last flat light of afternoon, the kind of light that makes shadows long and edges precise. A knock came 20 minutes later. Not medical staff. The knock was slower, more deliberate. A woman entered, mid-50s, dark jacket and NTSB lanyard. She introduced herself as a senior field investigator and held a manila folder in both hands in a way that communicated its weight before she said a word. "I need you to see something," she said, "before it enters the formal record." She set the folder on the bed beside Kate's hand. Kate opened it. The document inside had the format of an NTSB accident investigation file. She recognized the structure immediately. She had read dozens of them over 17 years. The case number at the top was dated August 1993. Her father's name was printed below it. She read it the way she had always read technical documents, methodically, completely, not allowing the weight of what she was reading to interrupt the reading itself, because interrupting meant stopping, and she was not going to stop. The investigators had gone back into archived component records. They had run the serial numbers of every part installed in Garrett Harmon's aircraft against the defective range that Kate's 2022 report had identified. The cross-reference had taken one afternoon. The HV7 series valve installed in her father's aircraft that morning in August 1993 fell within the defective serial range. The failure pattern documented in his accident investigation, the one attributed to pilot disorientation with no identified mechanical cause, the one that had produced the conclusion of pilot error, was fully consistent with the chemical contamination profile that Kate had spent years documenting. The investigators in 1993 had not known to look at the valve. The manufacturer had identified the defect internally and had not disclosed it. The investigators had worked with what they had and reached the only conclusion available to them. It was the wrong conclusion. At the bottom of the last page, a single handwritten note had been added in the margin. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind of careful that suggested the person writing it understood they were putting something important into a space not designed to hold it. It read, "Based on newly identified component data, original determination of pilot error is inconsistent with available evidence. Formal review recommended. Kate read the note twice. She set the folder down on the blanket. Her father had been flying that aircraft the same way she had been flying the 737 today. Correctly, carefully, with everything he had. He had not made an error. He had been placed in an aircraft with a component that someone knew was failing, and he had died because no one had told him to look at it, and for 30 years his record had said the fault was his. He was not wrong. He had never been wrong. She had known it since she was 12 years old. She had carried the knowledge and the proof and the weight of the injustice through 17 years of service and 6 months of trying to become someone who did not carry those things. And now she was sitting in a hospital room in Montana with an official document in her lap, and it said in handwriting that would eventually become formal language, an official record, what she had always known. The NTSB investigator was watching her from beside the door, quietly, with the stillness of someone who has delivered difficult truths before and understands that presence is the only thing required afterward. Kate said, "Thank you for bringing this to me yourself." The investigator nodded once. "The formal review will take time," she said, "but the record will reflect the evidence." She left. Kate sat with the dog tags in her open hand. She did not know she was crying until she felt it on her face. Not the way she would cry an hour later with Nora and Emma in the room. This was different. This was private and old, and had been waiting a very long time for a specific piece of information to arrive before it was allowed to come. She let it come. For Sam. Declan Caldwell appeared in the doorway 40 minutes later. She knew him by his flight suit before she looked at his face. Malmstrom patch on the shoulder. The economy of movement that came from spending professional time in small cockpits, a habit of occupying exactly the space required and no more. He was around 35 with a face weathered by time at altitude, and he was holding his helmet under his left arm and standing in the doorway with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and arrived uncertain that the rehearsal was sufficient. Major Declan Caldwell. Malmstrom, I was Raptor 11. I had eyes on your approach. He came a few steps into the room and stopped. He was not comfortable. She recognized the discomfort. It belonged to someone who has spent the last several hours revising their understanding of something and has arrived at a conclusion that requires a form of honesty they are still locating. I pulled your record after I landed. He said it evenly. I read your file. He paused. I read the report you filed in 2022, the HV7 valve. Kate waited. You tried to stop this. He said it without decoration 2 years ago. You found the defect and documented it and filed the report, and they classified it non-critical and left the valve in service. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at her. And today you were on the aircraft when it failed. And you were the only person on that aircraft who could do what you did, because of what you know, because of what it cost you to learn it. He stopped. She said yes. He seemed to be looking for something further to say and not finding it, and finally he said what was underneath everything else, I owe you an apology. She raised her eyebrows slightly. I watched your approach from altitude. He said it steadily, looking at her directly. Your profile was textbook. Your configuration sequence was correct. Your handling of the Cessna conflict, I saw that. I saw what you did. He shook his head slowly. I watched all of it, and I still told myself it might be luck. I told myself I didn't know if it was going to be enough until I saw the mains touch. He paused. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't accurate. I knew what I was looking at. I just hadn't decided yet to trust what I was looking at. In Kate's experience, this kind of honesty arrived in one of two ways. Either when there was nothing to lose by it, or when the evidence had become too clear to deny without active dishonesty, and the person was not willing to be actively dishonest. Caldwell was the second kind. She respected the second kind. You made it home, she said. That's all I needed. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into a flight suit pocket and produced a card with a handwritten number on the back. Colonel Reeves has been trying to reach you, he said. She said to use this if your phone is off. He nodded once, less formal than a salute, carrying more weight, and left. Kate looked at the number on the card. She picked up the hospital phone. Dana Reeves answered on the second ring, which meant she had been sitting beside her phone, which was exactly what Kate would have expected. There was a pause before either of them spoke. The pause of two people who know each other well enough that the pause is its own form of communication. Solo Viper said, her voice careful, "Are you all right?" It was not quite a question. It was the sentence of someone who already knew the answer was complicated and was offering room for the complication. I'm in a hospital bed in Great Falls with an IV in my arm, and I can see the mountains from the window. Kate said it without affect. So, Relatively speaking, she heard Viper exhale, long and slow. The whole community, Viper said. Kate, I have calls from 3 different bases in the last 2 hours. I have a message from a wing commander at Langley. I haven't been able to return because I've been trying to reach you. She stopped. Hawk Caldwell called me before he drove to the hospital. He told me what he watched. He told me about the Cessna. He told me about the approach. Kate said nothing. He told me he read your 2022 report, Viper said. He told me he understood what you were doing in that cockpit today. Not just the flying. All of it. Kate looked at the mountains. They are saying your call sign. Viper said it quietly. The F-22 guys. Langley, Malmstrom. Nellis called me 20 minutes ago. They are saying it the way she stopped. You know how they say it, Kate. You know what it means when it sounds like that. Kate knew. She had heard it said that way about 2 or 3 pilots in 17 years. When a name stops being a designation and becomes a standard. When the people saying it are not paying a compliment, but making a statement about what excellence costs and what it produces and what it looks like when someone carries it without asking to be recognized for carrying it. I just wanted to visit my sister, Kate said. She meant it as a small deflection. It came out as something simply true. I know, Viper said. And then after a long moment, you carried him with you for 30 years. His name, his record, the proof of what was done to him. You carried all of it through everything. She paused. Today he flew with you, Kate, one last time, and you landed perfectly. Kate sat with that. She sat with it the way you sit with something that has been too large to hold directly for a long time and is now for the first time exactly the right size to fit inside the space you have been keeping for it. She did not say anything. Viper, who knew her, did not require her to. They stayed on the line together for another few minutes without speaking. 2 people connected across distance by something that had no adequate name in any language Kate knew. And then Viper said quietly, "Call your sister. She's been watching the news for the last 3 hours." Kate said she would. She hung up. She sat in the room in the fading light and did not reach for the phone immediately. She looked at the manila folder still on the blanket beside her, at her father's name printed below the case number, at the handwritten note in the margin that said what 30 years of carrying had been trying to say. She put her hand flat on the folder, not gripping it, just resting there, the way you rest your hand on something that is finished. Mom. Nora Callahan appeared in the doorway at 7:15. Kate had been expecting a nurse. She had not been expecting a woman in her mid-30s with dark circles under her eyes and a child on her hip, and an expression that contained the aftermath visible on someone who has been very frightened and has come out the other side of the fear into something that needed to be expressed to a specific person. Emma was wearing a jacket over her seatbelt rumpled clothes and holding the stuffed rabbit with one ear shorter than the other. She was looking at Kate with the direct assessment of a 6-year-old examining something new and interesting, reserving judgment, gathering information. "We shouldn't stay long," Nora said. She stopped just inside the door. Emma wanted to come. I wanted to come. She shook her head slightly. I've been trying to figure out what to say for the last 3 hours, and I don't have it. You don't need to say anything, Kate said. Nora shook her head again, not with disagreement, with the helplessness of someone who has understood that words are insufficient and intends to use them anyway because they are what she has. "My daughter," she said, simply. That was all. Kate looked at Emma. Emma had been watching the exchange with the patience of someone who has been told this will matter and has decided to take that on faith. Now she reached into the pocket of her jacket, a child's pocket, small and slightly misshapen from the things it usually held, and produced a folded piece of paper. She held it out toward Kate. Kate took it. She unfolded it. It was a drawing in blue and green crayon with yellow for the sky and a large approximate circle that was the sun. The drawing showed an aircraft recognizable as such because it had wings and a body and what might have been windows along the side. Beneath the aircraft was a ground of green crayon, and beside the aircraft was a figure, a woman indicated primarily by a ponytail, standing with her arms slightly away from her body in the posture of someone who has just completed something and is deciding what to do with her hands. Beneath the drawing, in the careful, effortful print of a child who has recently learned to write and forms each letter with total conscious attention, it read, "The lady who flew us home." Kate looked at it for a long time. Something in her face had changed. She could feel it happening without being able to stop it. Something behind the eyes, something that had been held at a precise, controlled distance for a very long time and had simply run out of distance to hide behind. It was the first time in this entire day, in longer than this day, in longer than she could quickly calculate, that she had arrived somewhere that control was the wrong instrument to apply. She folded the drawing carefully along its original creases. She held it in both hands, and she cried. Not loudly, not with the dramatic release of someone who has been waiting for permission. Quietly, steadily, in the way that people cry when they have been carrying something at altitude for a very long time and have finally brought it all the way down to the ground where it belongs. Nora Callahan put her free hand on Kate's forearm and left it there and said nothing, which was exactly right. Emma watched with wide eyes and then, apparently deciding that this situation called for the deployment of her most important resource, held out the stuffed rabbit. Kate looked at the rabbit. She looked at Emma. She took the rabbit, held it for a moment, and handed it back with a gravity that Emma received with total seriousness, as though a transaction of genuine significance had been completed between them, which perhaps it had. They left after a few minutes. Nora and Emma and Kate was alone again, in the room with the mountains and the drawing and the dog tags and the folder and the IV that was almost finished. She thought about her father without the project attached, without the evidence in the report and the next step in the long process of making the system acknowledge what it had done. Just him. She thought about the way he had smelled aviation fuel and aftershave, a combination that still reached her sometimes in unexpected places and brought with it a quality of Saturday morning that nothing else could reproduce. She thought about his hands on the yoke of the small Cessna he kept at the local airfield, the patience with which he had taught her to find the horizon and hold it, the tone of voice he used when she got something right. Not praise exactly, more like recognition, like he was confirming something he had already known. She thought about the reports she had not been able to read until she was an adult, the ones that described what the HV-7 valve did in technical language that was worse in some ways and better in others than the language of imagination. She thought about being alone in the cockpit today. She thought about his dog tags against her chest while she flew. She had thought of it for 30 years as a weight she bore on his behalf, an obligation, proof of a debt that was owed and had not been paid. She had not thought of it until Viper said the words this evening as something else, as company, as his presence in every cockpit she had ever occupied, looking over her shoulder the way he had looked over her shoulder in the small Cessna when she was 12 years old, the year he died, the year she started becoming the pilot who could land that aircraft today. She had not become that pilot despite losing him. She had become that pilot because of losing him. Because of what losing him had required her to understand about aircraft and about systems and about the particular failure modes of components that nobody thought to classify as critical until the cost of that classification became too clear to ignore. His death had been the wound, and the wound had been today the only thing that could save them. She did not know exactly how to feel about that. It was more like something to sit with. A fact about the shape of things that required time and would probably never be fully comprehended. Only gradually less incomprehensible, the way grief itself moved not toward an ending, but toward a different quality of presence. She reached under her sweater. She unclasped the chain. She held the dog tags in her open palm. Harmon Garrett W. She looked at his name for a long time, at the letters she had read by feel in the dark for 30 years, at the metal that had been warm against her body since she was 12 years old and was room temperature, now no longer warm from her skin, which meant she had been holding them in her open hand long enough for the heat to equalize. She was not finished loving him. She would never be finished loving him. But she thought, sitting in a hospital room in Great Falls, Montana, with the mountains going dark outside the window, and a child's drawing folded in her other hand, in an official document on the blanket beside her that said in the language of formal record what she had always known, that she was perhaps finished carrying him, that the carrying had arrived somewhere today, that it had delivered what it was always delivering and could now be set down. Not abandoned, set down. There was a difference. She had always known the difference. She had just never been standing in the place where the difference was real until now. 3 weeks later, Kate Harmon drove through the gates of Arlington National Cemetery on a Wednesday morning in late March. The air was cold and clear, the cold of early spring in Virginia that had not yet decided to become anything other than winter. The grass was the color of dry straw. The rows of white markers stretched in every direction with the ordered geometry of something that had been thought about very carefully, as though the thinking could be adequate to what it was organizing. She found Section 7C. She had been here twice before. Once at the funeral, which she did not remember clearly because she had been 12 and her mother had held her hand, and the only thing she remembered with any precision was the sound of the rifles and the way the flag was folded. Once in her first year at the Air Force Academy, 20 years old alone, needing to say something she had not yet found words for, and ultimately saying nothing, just standing. She stood in front of the marker. Garrett W. Harmon, Lieutenant Colonel USAF, August 14th, 1993. Beloved father and husband. She stood there for a while without doing anything. The wind moved through the cemetery with the quiet persistence of wind that has been moving through open spaces for a long time and does not require an audience. She reached into the pocket of her jacket. She took out the dog tags. She held them in her palm one more time, felt the weight, the temperature, the engraved letters, and then she crouched down and placed them on the ground in front of the marker. On the grass at the base of the stone where the earth met the marble. She did not explain this to him. She did not say anything aloud. She thought he probably understood without explanation. She thought he had probably understood for longer than she had. She stood back up. She looked at the marker for another moment. She said quietly to no one visible, and to him, "You were not wrong." Then she put her hands in her jacket pockets and walked back toward the car. She did not look back. She did not need to. She had spent 30 years looking back. Whatever came next would face forward. Somewhere over the American Midwest, that same Wednesday, a young pilot named Lieutenant Brooke Ferris was 3 weeks out of training and flying her first operational patrol in an F-22 Raptor out of Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. Her instructor, a veteran with 16 years in fighters, was flying formation off her right wing, watching her technique with the focused attention of someone whose job was noticing the things a new pilot did not yet know they were doing. The radio was quiet. The sky was the saturated blue that existed only above 30,000 feet, a blue so deep and final it looked like the end of something. Lieutenant Ferris was doing well. She was doing better than well. She had the instinct, the spatial awareness, the feel for the aircraft that could not be taught, only discovered in someone who already possessed it. Her instructor was already thinking about what she was going to become. He clicked his mic. "You're flying clean up there, Ferris. Really clean." She said, "Thank you, sir." He let a moment pass, then he said, "You know the story of Solo." A pause. She had heard it. Everyone in her training class had heard it. She had heard it in the ready room and in the mess, and once from an instructor who had told it the way you tell something you were close to, even if you weren't there. "Yes, sir. The commercial airliner. Great Falls." He let another moment pass. The aircraft held their positions, two of them moving together through the blue above America, the ground too far below to be more than geometry. She tried to stop it before it happened, he said, 2 years before. She filed a report about the exact component that failed. She documented the defect and submitted the evidence, and the system classified it non-critical and moved on. And then she happened to be on the aircraft when the valve failed anyway. Lieutenant Ferris said nothing. She was listening the way you listen when something true is being spoken aloud for the first time. She didn't land that aircraft despite what it cost her to know what she knew he said. She landed it because of what it cost her. Every hour she spent tracking that defect every year, of carrying what happened to her father every morning. She put those dog tags on all of it was in her hands when she sat down in that cockpit. He paused. That's what we don't say enough. The things that break us open are sometimes the only things that make us ready for the moments that require everything. The sky held them both. When I think about how good a pilot can be, he said simply, I think about what she did alone in that cockpit with everything taken away and what she gave back to 173 people who would never know her name. That's the standard. That's what we're reaching for. Brooke Ferris keyed her mic. She said the call sign. She said it the way it was said now in ready rooms and cockpits, in the spaces between formal language where the real language lived. Quietly, without drama. With the weight of full understanding behind it, not just of what had happened on a Tuesday in Montana, but of what the name meant when you stripped away the story and looked at the thing underneath it. What it meant about preparation and cost in the relationship between what a life asks of you and what you find yourself able to give when the moment finally arrives. Solo. The word went out over the frequency and hung there in the cold blue air above the American interior, and then the aircraft banked south and the radio went quiet again, and the sky held them and the day continued, and somewhere below in a car on a highway in Virginia, a woman drove away from a cemetery with her hands steady on the wheel and her eyes on the road ahead.